The Case of the Blood-Stained Spectacles. Inspector Purbright, BBC radio drama. The air in the main marquee of the Flaxborough District Horticultural Society's annual flower show was a thick, devotional fugue of damp soil, crushed grass, and the cloying sweetness of 1,000 competing blooms. It was, Inspector Purbright reflected, the smell of concerted effort. Here nature was not so much celebrated as disciplined, coaxed, and sternly admonished into unnatural perfection. Roses stood to attention like guardsmen, carrots lay in ranks of unnerving uniformity, and the onions, dear Lord, the onions were polished to a luster that would have shamed a master cabinet maker. Purbright, in a civilian tweed jacket that felt only marginally less restrictive than his uniform, was navigating the narrow aisle between the dahlias and the delphiniums. He was not, by temperament, a flower show man. His own garden was a place of quiet surrender, where blackspot and greenfly were regarded less as enemies and more as persistent, if unwelcome tenants. He was present today as a matter of civic duty, a polite nod to the institutions that kept Flaxborough ticking over with the gentle, inexorable rhythm of a grandfather clock. The epicenter of the day's activity was the trestle table bearing the society's silverware. Cups, bowls, and shields gleamed under the canvas-filtered sunlight, each a monument to some past triumph over slug or mildew. The grandest of them all, sitting on a plinth of dark velvet, was the Chalford Perpetual Challenge Cup, awarded for the best petunia in show. For the past 7 years the cup had been the exclusive property of Mr. Alistair Finch, a retired actuary, whose relationship with his petunias was rumoured to be the most emotionally profound of his life. His entry this year, a vulgar eruption of magenta and white named the Finch Flambe, sat in its pot beside the empty plinth, radiating an aura of insufferable confidence. Everyone in the marquee knew it would win. The only suspense lay in the precise degree of false modesty Mr. Finch would employ in his acceptance speech. Councillor Whitney, a man whose chest seemed permanently inflated with the importance of local government, tapped the microphone. He was the day's master of ceremonies, a role he approached with the solemnity of a bishop at a coronation. "Ladies and gentlemen, exhibitors, friends of the flower," he began, his voice echoing slightly. "We come now to the moment of supreme floricultural achievement." He paused, allowing the gravity of the occasion to settle. The Chalford Perpetual Challenge Cup. A ripple of polite applause, thin as a winter breeze, moved through the assembled crowd. People shuffled their feet. Mrs. Godby from the railway buffet adjusted her hat, her expression one of pained anticipation. Purbright noted that Mr. Finch himself was not in his customary position in the front row, an odd omission. For Finch, missing the preamble to his own victory would be like a cat declining to torment a mouse. "A truly magnificent display this year," Councillor Whitney boomed, gesturing vaguely at the petunia. "But our judges, after much, and I mean much deliberation, have once again found a standard of excellence that is, well, it is the standard to which all others must aspire." He beamed, turning towards Finch's prize specimen. "It is my great honor to announce that the winner, for the 8th consecutive year, is Mr. Alistair Finch for his spectacular Finch Flambe." The applause was a little stronger this time, mixed with the resigned sighs of the other petunia growers. All eyes scanned the crowd for the victor. There was a hesitant lull. "Mr. Finch," Councillor Whitney called, his smile faltering slightly. "Alistair, do come and collect your award." Silence. Horace Dibdin, Finch's nearest rival, allowed a small sour smile to flicker across his lips before quickly suppressing it. With the air of a man forced to improvise, Whitney cleared his throat. "Well, he appears to be momentarily detained. No matter, I shall accept it on his behalf." He turned to the velvet plinth, his hands outstretched to receive the gleaming silver cup. He stopped. His hands hovered, then dropped to his sides. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion, as if he had reached for a teacup and found a toad. He leaned closer, peering at the object on the plinth. The crowd murmured, their polite interest curdling into genuine curiosity. What could possibly be wrong? Purbright, using his height to his advantage, saw it. The Chalford Perpetual Challenge Cup was gone. In its place, sitting precisely in the center of the worn velvet, was a pair of spectacles. They were of a plain wire-rimmed design, but that was not what held the collective gaze of the Marquis. One of the lenses was cracked, and across the bridge and the right-hand arm was a dark, unmistakable smear. It was the color of dried blood. A single horrified gasp escaped from Miss Portley, the stationer. The murmur of the crowd died instantly, replaced by a thick, ringing silence. Councillor Whitney stood frozen, his hand still half extended, a man utterly adrift from his script. Inspector Purbright felt a familiar, weary tightening in his shoulders. It seemed his day of civic duty was not yet over. The quiet, disciplined order of the Flaxborough Flower Show had just been comprehensively disturbed. For a long moment, the Marquis was held in a state of suspended animation. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the silence fractured into 1,000 tiny whispers. The sound was not loud, but it filled the space more completely than Councillor Whitney's microphone ever had. It was the sound of a story being born. People began to edge away from the trestle table, not in fear but with a kind of communal reverence for the scandal of it all. They moved with the delicate choreography of those trying to get a better view without appearing ghoulishly interested. The news did not so much travel from the Marquis as escape it, seeping out with the first wave of attendees, who suddenly remembered urgent appointments elsewhere. It was a piece of information too potent to be contained by canvas walls. By the time Sergeant Love, a man whose earnestness was a constant source of quiet bafflement to his superior, had placed the spectacles into an evidence bag, with the care of a jeweler handling a crown, the story was already halfway down the high street, mutating with every retelling. At the railway station buffet, a place that served as Flaxborough's unofficial court of public opinion, Mrs. Goadby was holding forth over a lukewarm pot of tea. "Hooligans," she declared, striking a teaspoon against her saucer for emphasis. "It's got to be. From Chalford, I'll be bound. They come over here, they see our civic pride, our magnificent blooms, and they can't stand it. It's jealousy pure and simple. They've likely done for poor Mr. Finch and left his spectacles as a calling card." Her audience, a captive collection of waiting passengers and off-duty railwaymen, nodded gravely. The Chalford theory was comforting. It placed the unpleasantness firmly outside the town's own moral boundary. A more elaborate narrative was taking root a few doors down, in the hushed, lavender-scented confines of Miss Portley's stationer's shop. Miss Portley, whose worldview had been shaped by a lifetime of selling greetings cards for every conceivable human emotion, favored a more passionate interpretation. "It's a personal matter, mark my words," she confided to a customer ostensibly buying writing paper. "You have to ask yourself, who would have a reason to strike a man like Mr. Finch? A man of such precision." She lowered her voice. "He was seen walking out with the widow, Mrs. Appleyard, very frequently. A flamboyant woman, if you ask me. All those scarves." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air between the birthday cards and the fountain pens. "Perhaps he tried to break it off. A woman scorned, you know, or perhaps there's another man. One can only imagine the scene." By mid-afternoon, these competing theories had begun to coalesce, guided into a more cohesive shape by the authoritative pronouncements of Councillor Whitney. Having recovered from his initial shock, he had embraced his role as the public face of the crisis. He'd given a statement to the Flaxborough Chronicle, expressing his profound dismay that such a cowardly and unsettling act could mar the town's premier cultural event. "One is forced to conclude," he told the editor, his voice resonating with civic injury, "that this is not some random act of vandalism. This is targeted. This is malicious." He did not need to name a suspect. His gaze drifted meaningfully towards the distant table, where Horace Dibby's distinctly inferior petunias were now being packed away. "The world of competitive horticulture, I'm afraid, is not for the faint of heart. Passions run high. When a man achieves a level of perfection as consistently as Alistair Finch, it is bound to breed a certain resentment, a dangerous resentment it would now appear. And so by the time the last of the unsold geraniums had been cleared from the marquee, a consensus had been reached. Miss Finch had not simply misplaced his spectacles. He had been the victim of a violent assault, an act born of a rival's desperate jealousy, possibly complicated by a woman of questionable taste in scarves. He was, in all likelihood, lying grievously injured in a ditch somewhere. The blood-stained spectacles were no longer a peculiar mystery. They were Exhibit A in a tragedy. Inspector Purbright, sitting in his office and listening to Sergeant Love's dutiful summary of the town's chatter, steepled his fingers. He found it endlessly fascinating how a complete lack of facts never seemed to impede the formation of a conclusion. While Flaxborough was busy solving the crime, he supposed it was time he went and established if one had actually been committed. Primrose Cottage was, in Purbright's estimation, less a home and more a declaration of principles. It stood slightly apart from its neighbors, separated by a privet hedge of such geometric severity that it might have been cut with a set square and spirit level. The gravel on the path was raked into hypnotic patterns, and the roses in the garden, each one labeled with a small immaculate slate tag, were models of disciplined growth, entirely free from the democratic encroachments of aphid or weed. There was not a single fallen petal on the lawn. It was the sort of garden that made one feel nervously inadequate. "Looks like he's in, sir," Sergeant Love observed, pointing to a copy of the Times visible through the leaded glass of the front door, placed squarely in the center of the doormat. "Post's been collected." "One assumes Mr. Finch does not allow his correspondents to loiter, Sergeant," Purbright murmured, pressing the doorbell. The resulting chime was a modest, two-note affair, perfectly pitched between welcoming and intrusive. The door was opened by a man who could only have been Alistair Finch. He was tall and spare, dressed in pressed grey flannels and a tweed waistcoat, despite the warmth of the afternoon. The most arresting feature of his appearance, however, was the large surgical white plaster affixed squarely to the bridge of his nose. Beneath it, the first faint blossoms of a bruise were visible on his cheekbone. He regarded his visitors through a pair of immaculate spectacles, his expression one of pained forbearance, as if he had been interrupted in the middle of a complex calculation. "Yes?" he inquired. The word was not a question, but a barrier. "Mr. Alistair Finch?" Purbright asked, though there was no doubt. "I am Detective Inspector Purbright. This is Sergeant Love. Might we have a moment of your time?" Finch's thin lips tightened. "I cannot imagine why. I am, as you can see, rather occupied with my recovery." He gestured vaguely towards his plastered nose. "It's about your recovery that we've come, in a manner of speaking," Purbright said, his tone gently apologetic. "There was a small matter at the flower show this afternoon." With visible reluctance, Finch stepped back, admitting them into a hallway that smelled of beeswax and old paper. The interior of the cottage was as meticulously controlled as the exterior. Every object had its place, every surface gleamed. It was a room in which one felt hesitant to breathe too deeply. "If this is about the trophy," Finch began, leading them into a small, perfect sitting room, "I trust the society will see to its recovery. I have no time for such vulgar theatrics." "It's not the trophy, Mr. Finch," Purbright said, taking in the room. A handsome writing desk stood by the window, its leather top bare save for a silver inkstand, a blotter, and a neat stack of crested paper. "It's what was left in its place." Sergeant Love, on cue, produced the clear evidence bag. Inside, the bloodied spectacles looked obscene in the pristine environment. Finch glanced at them, his face betraying nothing but irritation. "And what have these to do with me?" "We had rather hoped they were yours, sir," Love said earnestly. "Then you hoped in error, Sergeant," Finch snapped. "My spectacles, as you can see, are on my face. I suggest you look for their owner elsewhere. Now if you'll excuse me, you've had a nasty fall, sir," Purbright interjected smoothly, his gaze resting on the plaster. Finch touched his nose gingerly. "Yes, as a matter of fact, I did. I was trimming the climbing rose on the east wall. The ladder shifted. A moment of carelessness, entirely my own fault. It was a most unpleasant experience, and I have no desire to discuss it further." He delivered the explanation like a man reciting a proof, a sequence of logical facts that permitted no argument. "So the blood on those spectacles couldn't be yours?" Purbright asked, his voice still mild. "Inspector, must I repeat myself? They are not my spectacles. Therefore the substance upon them is of no concern to me." His condescension was as polished as his furniture. Purbright nodded slowly, his eyes wandering to the writing desk by the window. There, lying next to the silver inkstand, was another pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. They were identical in every detail: the plain design, the delicate arms, the almost invisible maker's mark, to the pair resting in Sergeant Love's evidence bag. One must always be prepared, of course, Purbright mused as if thinking aloud. Having a spare pair is only sensible for emergencies. A flicker of something, alarm perhaps, or merely heightened annoyance, passed through Finch's eyes. He made a slight involuntary movement towards the desk. "My habits are my own affair, Inspector." "Of course," Purbright agreed placidly. He turned to his sergeant. "You've made a note of the prescription details from the item we found, have you not, Love?" "Yes, sir, from the optician's stamp on the inside of the frame." "Excellent." Purbright gave Mr. Finch a polite, unreadable smile. "Well, we shan't take up any more of your recovery time. Thank you for clarifying the matter of ownership." As they walked back down the obsessively tidy gravel path, Sergeant Love could no longer contain his frustration. "Sir, he's lying. That pair on the desk is the spitting image of the ones we've got. Why on earth would he deny it?" "That, Sergeant," said Inspector Purbright, pausing to observe a rose that had dared to bloom in a slightly disorderly fashion, "is a far more interesting question than who gave him a bloody nose." Finch's beeswax polish still clinging to his jacket, when the door to his office was thrust open. The arrival of Councillor Whitney was never a quiet event. He entered a room not so much by walking as by occupying it, his presence expanding to fill any available vacuum of silence or inactivity. Today he was practically vibrating with purpose, his face flushed with the thrill of civic duty. "Purbright," he announced, forgoing any conventional greeting. "I've got him, the fellow behind this whole ghastly affair. It's as clear as..." Purbright looked up from the preliminary report he had just begun to write. "Do sit down, Councillor. Would you care for a cup of tea?" "No time for tea, man. This is a matter of public safety. The sanctity of the flower show has been violated." He planted his hands firmly on the edge of Purbright's desk, and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial boom. "It's Dibdin, Horace Dibdin." He delivered the name with the finality of a judge passing sentence. Purbright blinked slowly. "The Petunia Grove." "The very same," Whitney confirmed, straightening up, satisfied with the impact of his revelation. "The man is consumed by a poisonously green-eyed monster. I've seen it in his eyes for years. Always the runner-up, always standing in Finch's shadow. A man can only take so much public humiliation, Inspector." Purbright made a small non-committal steeple of his fingers. "Do you have any specific reason for this suspicion, besides horticultural disappointment?" "Specific reason?" Whitney. "I have a motive, an opportunity and a witness." "Me?" He tapped his own chest. "I saw them not a week ago, right outside the town hall. They were having a ferocious argument." "An argument about what?" "Soil acidity," Whitney declared, as if revealing the details of a blood pact. "Finch, you see, advocates a strictly organic approach. Well-rotted compost. A little lime, Dibdin. On the other hand, well, the man's a chemical merchant. Sulfate of ammonia superphosphates. He practically forces his blooms into existence." Finch made a remark, quite calmly, about the unnatural vibrancy of Dibdin's petunias, said they lacked character. Purbright's expression remained one of polite neutrality. "And how did Mr. Dibdin respond to this critique?" "He went puce, Inspector. The color of an overfed plum." He started shouting about pH levels and modern techniques. He accused Finch of being a hidebound amateur. And then, and this is the crucial part, he pointed a soil-stained finger at him, and said, "You and your blasted trophies won't be lording it over me forever, Finch. There's always a day of reckoning." Councillor Whitney leaned back, his case presented. To his mind it was an unimpeachable chain of logic. A public threat, a history of rivalry, and now a violent act. What more could a policeman possibly need? "A day of reckoning," Purbright repeated softly as if tasting the words. "It has a certain dramatic flair." "Exactly. The man as good as confessed his intentions in broad daylight. Finch bests him again at the show. So Dibdin lies in wait, assaults him, steals the cup out of sheer spite, and leaves the spectacles as a warning. It's open and shut." He glanced at the telephone on Purbright's desk.
I assume you'll be having him brought in immediately. We will of course be having a word with Mr. Dibbin in due course, Purbright said, his tone meticulously level. Thank you, Counselor. You've been most helpful. This seemed to satisfy Whitney, who saw the inspector's calmness, not as skepticism, but as the quiet efficiency of a professional about to pounce. He gave a sharp, satisfied nod. Good. The sooner these ruffians learn that Flaxborough does not tolerate such behavior, the better. Let me know if you need any further statements. With that he turned and marched out, leaving a wake of agitated air and absolute certainty behind him. Sergeant Love, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped inside. A day of reckoning, sir. Over soil acidity. Purbright picked up his pen and looked down at his blank report. People have come to blows over matters of far less consequence, Sergeant, he observed, especially when the real argument is not about soil but about status. He made a small note on his blot. Nevertheless, it does seem a rather neat solution, doesn't it? Almost as if it were written for a public performance. While Councillor Whitney's theory was being embellished and embroidered in every pub and post office queue in Flaxborough, the inspector found his thoughts circling not around Horace Dibbidon's temper, but Alistair Finch's lie. A man so fanatically devoted to order does not create disorder in his own life without a compelling reason. Pride was certainly a motive, but Purbright suspected it was not the whole of it. He decided a second visit to Primrose Cottage was in order. A direct approach would be useless. Finch had sealed himself behind a wall of indignant denial. A flanking maneuver was required. He and Sergeant Love arrived at the cottage shortly after 10 o'clock, timing their visit to coincide with the likely departure of any domestic help. They were in luck. A stout woman with iron grey hair and an expression of put-upon virtue was just emerging from the side gate, carrying a string bag. Mrs. Parsons, Purbright inquired, his tone mild. Mr. Finch's daily help. The woman stopped, her look a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. I might be. Who's asking? Inspector Purbright. We're just making some routine follow-up inquiries about Mr. Finch's unfortunate accident yesterday. Mrs. Parsons's face softened with a professional's sympathy. Oh, it was a terrible thing, a terrible shock for him. All that blood on the tea towel when I came in this morning, and him a man who can't abide a crumb out of place. Said he felt faint while up the ladder. It's his age, you know. Quite, Purbright agreed. He is, I imagine, a man of very regular habit. This was the correct key to unlock Mrs. Parsons. Regular doesn't begin to describe it, Inspector, she said, shifting her bag. 10 o'clock his mid-morning tea, 12:30, his lunch cold cuts on a Monday. No exceptions. Everything has its place. If I move his paperweight a quarter of an inch to the left he notices. He's what you'd call meticulous. She said the word with a blend of exasperation and pride. An orderly house is a sign of an orderly mind, they say, Purbright off. Well, his mind must be as tidy as a parade ground then, she sniffed. You've never seen a pantry like it. Every tin facing forward, every jar polished, alphabetical. Some of it, really. Purbright allowed a note of gentle admiration to enter his voice. I don't suppose we could impose upon you to show us. It's just that in a case like this, a fall, a possible dizzy spell, we sometimes find a small detail, something out of place in the kitchen perhaps, that can shed a little light. It was a thin pretext, but Miss Parsons, flattered to have her domain recognized as a source of police interest, puffed up slightly. Well, I've just finished tidying it myself, so I don't see the harm. She led them back through the side gate and into a kitchen that was as sterile and organized as a laboratory. The pantry was a small walk-in cupboard, and it was a marvel of domestic precision. Shelves of tinned goods stood in serried ranks. Spices were arranged on a rack, alphabetically from allspice to turmeric. On the top shelf a row of jams and marmalades gleamed like jewels. Mrs. Parsons gestured to them with a proprietary air. You see, all his favorites. He has an order delivered from London every month. Purbright's eyes scanned the shelf. It was perfect, a testament to a life from which all chaos had been ruthlessly excised. And yet, there was a small gap, a single jar-sized space in the otherwise unbroken line. It sat between a jar of Dundee orange and one of lemon curd. He seems to be running low on one of his preserves, Purbright remarked casually. Mrs. Parsons followed his gaze and frowned. Now that's peculiar. She stepped into the pantry, her brow furrowed in concentration. The monthly order came on Tuesday. I put it all away myself, and his green gauge and ginger always goes right there. She pointed a decisive finger at the empty space. He'd never move it. He likes the color sequence, he says. Green gauge and ginger marmalade. That's the one. Ever so expensive. He has it on his toast on Fridays. Only Fridays. She looked genuinely perplexed. He wouldn't have finished a jar already, and he certainly wouldn't have thrown it away. Miss Finch doesn't believe in waste. She began looking around the pantry floor, as if it might have simply rolled away. Perhaps he misplaced it, Sergeant Love suggested. Mrs. Parsons shot him a look of pity. Miss Finch, she said, with the weight of absolute authority, does not misplace things. I see, said Purbright. He looked at the small significant void on the shelf. In this house, a house that was a fortress against the unpredictable mess of life, that small gap was more jarring than a smashed window. It was a flaw in the code, a detail that did not compute. It belonged to a different story than the one about a man losing his balance on a ladder. It also seemed to have very little to do with a feud over petunias. Thank you, Mrs. Parsons, he said, stepping out of the immaculate kitchen. You've been a great help. As they walked away from the cottage, Love looked at the inspector. Sir, are we really concerned about a missing jar of marmalade? At present, Sergeant, Purbright replied. I am more concerned about it than I am about almost anything else. A missing jar of marmalade was not. Sergeant Love knew sufficient grounds to ignore the town's chosen suspect. Duty therefore dictated a visit to Horace Dibdin. They found him at his allotment on the edge of town, a chaotic acre of land that looked as if it had been tilled with explosives. Where Finch's garden was a study in submission, Dibdin's was a riot of defiant life. Cabbages grew with the swagger of wrestlers, and runner beans scrambled up their poles with anarchic glee. Dibdin himself, a short wiry man with soil etched into the lines of his face, was forking a compost heap with a vigor that bordered on vengeful. He barely paused as Purbright and Love approached, their polished shoes looking alien and foolish on the muddy path. If you're here about the cup, I haven't got it, he grunted, heaving a forkful of rotting vegetation. Though if I found it, I'd melt it down for scrap. We're not here about the cup, Mr. Dibdin, Purbright said pleasantly. We're here about Mr. Finch. Dibdin stopped and leaned on his fork, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a muddy hand. What about him? Has his nose fallen off? We understand you had a public disagreement with him last week, Purbright continued, undeterred by the man's belligerence. Regarding soil chemistry, a sour grin spread across Dibdin's face. Oh, that. Aye, we had word. He called my prize-winning petunias chemically overwrought. I told him his were anemic. The man wouldn't know a decent NPK ratio if it bit him on his well-pressed trousers. Thinks a bit of leaf mold is the answer to everything. He's a pompous fool. Strong words, Mr. Dibdin.
Honest words, Inspector. I've no time for dishonesty or for Alistair Finch. Enough time, perhaps, to strike him. Purbright asked, his voice softening to an almost conversational tone. Dibdin let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. He looked down at his calloused hands, then back at the inspector. Strike him? With my fists? Don't be ridiculous. I'm a gardener, not a brawler. He hefted the fork in his hands, its steel tines gleaming. If I were going to sort out Alistair Finch, I'd use a spade, far more effective. And you can dig a hole at the same time. Saves a job later. He winked, a gesture of such cheerful menace that it was almost disarming. Purbright found himself believing him. Their next visit was to a different world entirely. Miss Beatrice Appleyard lived in a small, semi-detached villa suffocated by chintz and potpourri. The air inside was thick with the scent of lilies, and a perfume that suggested a deep-seated fear of fresh air. Miss Appleyard herself, a woman wrapped in a cloud of pastel-colored scarves, received them with the tragic grace of a silent film star. Inspector, she sighed, placing a delicate hand on her chest. To what do I owe this intrusion? Has there been news about poor Alistair? Miss Finch is recovering well, Mrs. Appleyard, Purbright assured her. We're simply speaking to his friends. The word friends caused her to emit another deeper sigh. We were close, certainly. We had an arrangement. We would take constitutional walks together. He appreciated my conversation. You see, a man like Alistair, so precise, so grey, he needed a splash of colour in his life. She adjusted a lilac scarf. I provided that. And this arrangement is ongoing? A shadow passed across her carefully made-up face. A tear welled, but did not fall. Alistair ended our walks. Last month, he said my perfume was distracting, that it interfered with his appreciation of the natural aromas of the hedgerow. She delivered this line with the quiet dignity of a queen reporting a coup. A man can be terribly cruel when his heart is ruled by his nose. It was, Purbright thought, a motive of sorts. Wounded pride had sparked wars, let alone a smack on the nose. It must have been a disappointment for you, he murmured sympathetically. One bears one's disappointments, Inspector. She straightened a cushion that did not need straightening. Of course, it was not merely the companionship. I had hoped, as a dear friend, that he might see his way to assisting me with a small financial matter. My conservatory, she said, her voice growing faint with longing. It is in a dreadful state. The glass is cracked. The damp is terrible. My poor fuchsias. I thought a small loan to be repaid in due course. Naturally. But Alistair, for all his assets, is not a man of vision. He sees life as a balance sheet. He spoke of risk and unacceptable exposure. He simply refused. I see, Purbright said. He did. He saw a woman whose vanity had been wounded and whose plans had been thwarted. She had two excellent motives for being furious with Alistair Finch. He rose to leave. Poor Alistair, Mrs. Appleyard said again at the door, her voice trembling slightly. To be so clever with numbers and so foolish with people. He has no one to look after him, except of course for my nephew Cecil. The boy has been staying with me. He pops over to see Alistair now and then, just to check on him. Such a kind heart. Purbright filed this last piece of information away. A kind-hearted nephew, a refused loan, a broken-off friendship. The tidy allotment of Horace Dibbin's guilt was rapidly becoming an overgrown and tangled bed of nettles. Inspector Purbright believed that most investigations were not solved by flashes of inspiration, but by the patient accumulation of small awkward facts that refused to fit the prevailing narrative. He now had several. He had a man who claimed to have fallen off a ladder, but was pathologically unwilling to discuss it. He had a blood-stained pair of spectacles that the owner refused to acknowledge. He had a bitter rival who cheerfully admitted his hatred of the victim, but whose denial of assault felt entirely genuine. He had a spurned widow with motives of both pride and poverty, and most persistently, he had a missing jar of expensive marmalade. None of these pieces, however, he turned them, snapped neatly together. The fact that would begin to provide the necessary connection did not arrive with a frantic witness or a forensic discovery, but through a telephone call from a quietly agitated local businessman. Mr. Paisley, the proprietor of Flaxborough's oldest pharmacy, was a man who prided himself on the impeccable order of his accounts. A discrepancy in his ledger was, to him, a source of profound personal discomfort. I do hope I'm not wasting your time, Inspector. His precise, reedy voice began, but a rather troubling inconsistency has come to my attention regarding Mr. Alistair Finch. Go on, Mr. Paisley, Purbright said, doodling a small empty jam jar on his blotter. As you know, Miss Finch has maintained an account with my establishment for over 2 decades. His payments are a model of punctuality. A bill arrives, a check is dispatched, always, until yesterday. Purbright's interest sharpened slightly. What happened yesterday? I received our monthly invoice back from him, Paisley said, his voice laced with the pain of a rejected craftsman. With a note, a most brusque note. There was a rustle of paper. It simply says "not my purchase" and is initialed AF. Inspector, in 22 years Miss Finch has never disputed a charge. And what was the item in question? A bottle of French cologne. Le voleur, Paisley replied, pronouncing the name with distaste. It is, if I may say so, a rather loud fragrance. Not at all Mr. Finch's style. For years he has used a discreet bay rum. We keep it for him especially. And this Le Voleur, was it purchased in the shop? It was added to his account, Inspector. About 10 days ago, a young man came in and asked for it to be put on Mr. Finch's bill.
said he had Miss Finch's permission. We had no reason to doubt it. People run errands for one another. Purbright looked at the note he had made after his visit with Mrs. Appleyard. A kind-hearted nephew. He felt the faint, familiar tingle of a stray thread being pulled. Can you describe this young man, Miss Paisley? Oh, I know who he is, the pharmacist said. Charming fellow, always very well dressed, if a little polished. It's young Mr. Sussex, Mrs. Appleyard's nephew, the one who has been staying with her for the summer. Purbright drew a slow, deliberate circle around the jam jar on his blotter. And is this a cologne you stock regularly? Good heavens. No, it's far too theatrical for the Flaxborough taste. We only order it in for one customer. As a matter of fact, let me guess, Purbright said. Young Mr. Sussex. Precisely, Paisley confirmed, a note of vindication in his voice. He has a great fondness for it, though I must confess, his own account with me is not managed with anything approaching Mr. Finch's diligence. Purbright thanked the pharmacist for his information, promising to look into the clerical error, and slowly replaced the receiver. The case had just shifted. The grand passions of horticultural rivalry and romantic rejection suddenly seemed rather overblown. What was emerging instead was something smaller, shabbier, and infinitely more plausible. A picture was beginning to form in the inspector's mind. A picture of a charming, well-dressed young man, with expensive tastes, and it would seem flexible ethic. A young man who felt comfortable enough to charge his personal luxuries to an elderly acquaintance's account. Purbright considered the nature of such a deception. It wasn't grand theft, it was a quiet, parasitic erosion of trust. He looked again at the drawing of the jam jar, the expensive marmalade, the expensive cologne. They were not items of necessity. They were small, self-indulgent luxuries. They were perhaps the sort of things a person might pilfer if they believed they were entitled to a finer quality of life than the one they could afford. The kind-hearted nephew, it seemed, required a closer look. He sat on a bench facing the rose garden, a chaotic and cheerfully neglected affair that served as a public rebuke to the disciplined perfection, Alistair Finch's private collection. Here the roses sprawled and tangled, black spot was tolerated, and the scent was one of genuine untidy life. It was a better place for thinking. He found that the investigation had reached a point of quiet clarity. The loud public theories, Councillor Whitney's narrative of professional jealousy, Miss Portley's whispers of a lover's quarrel, felt increasingly like decorative screens, erected to hide a much plainer and more awkward piece of furniture. They were stories Flaxborough told itself because they were dramatic and satisfying, confirming long-held beliefs about the characters involved. Horace Dibben was sour, so he must be violent. Mrs. Appleyard was flamboyant, so she must be scorned and vengeful. But the truth, Purbright suspected, was rarely so theatrical. It was usually found in the small print of human behavior, in the returned invoice, the missing marmalade, the lie about a fall. These were not the actions of people in the grip of high passion. They were the actions of people trying to manage appearances. He considered Alistair Finch. The man's entire existence was a monument to control. His house, his garden, his finances, his reputation, all were maintained with the painstaking precision of an actuary calculating risk. Such a man would view a lapse in judgment as a catastrophic failure. To be made a fool of, to be taken advantage of by a charming young parasite like Sussex, would not just be an annoyance, it would be a fundamental violation of his identity. It would suggest that his carefully constructed world was vulnerable, his discernment flawed, and what of the crime itself? A clumsy punch to the nose, a pair of broken spectacles. It lacked the viciousness of true hatred, or the desperation of a spurned lover. It felt small, undignified. It was the sort of pathetic scuffle that happens in a hallway, not a dramatic assault worthy of public speculation. Here, Purbright felt, was the crux of it, the gap between reputation and character. Finch's reputation was for unassailable rectitude. To admit he had been duped, and then struck by his erstwhile friend's feckless nephew, would be to tarnish that reputation forever. He would be seen as a victim, and worse, a foolish one. But the story currently circulating in Flaxborough, the one involving a mysterious assailant and a dark professional rivalry, cast him in a far more compelling light. He was an enigma, a man whose success had earned him a dangerous enemy. The whole affair, Purbright mused as an errant petal from a peace rose drifted onto his shoe, might not be a crime of passion at all. It might be a crime of public relations. The initial incident, the confrontation with Cecil, was the simple, grubby but the second incident, the placement of the blood-stained spectacles on the trophy plinth, was an act of theatre. It was a calculated decision, designed to transform a private humiliation into a public mystery, thereby seizing control of the narrative. It was a brilliant, spiteful piece of social engineering, and it was entirely in keeping with the character of a man who preferred the clean logic of numbers to the messy reality of people. Finch wasn't just the victim, he was also the author. His course of action now seemed clear. He could not prove this theory with fingerprints or forensics. He could only prove it with human nature. He would have to assemble the cast and see how they performed when the script was subtly changed. Inspector Purbright knew that the Copper Kettle tea shop at 11 o'clock in the morning was the closest thing Flaxborough had to a public theatre. It was here that reputations were quietly revised, alliances subtly tested, and verdicts delivered over Battenberg. He also knew that Councillor Whitney could be relied upon to be holding court at his regular window table, a position from which he could survey the high street and dispense opinions with equal authority. A brief, polite telephone call to Mrs. Appleyard did the rest. Purbright framed it as a matter of convenience. There were one or two trivial points he needed to clarify, and rather than troubling her with a formal visit, perhaps she and her nephew might join him for a cup of tea. Miss Appleyard, who found the idea of being informally consulted by the police in a public setting irresistible, readily agreed. Purbright and Sergeant Love were already seated, stirring their tea when the Appleyards arrived. Cecil, a young man whose handsome face was beginning to show the faint, soft edges of a life lived without exertion, was dressed in a blazer and cravat, looking casually elegant. His aunt fluttered in his wake, a symphony in. As Purbright had anticipated, Councillor Whitney hailed them over immediately, eager to merge his audience with the inspectors. Purbright and Mrs. Appleyard, what a pleasant surprise, he boomed, gesturing to the empty chairs at his table. We were just discussing this appalling business with Alistair Finch. I was telling my colleague here that it's a shocking indictment of the moral decay creeping in from outside. It is simply dreadful, Mrs. Appleyard sighed, arranging her scarves as she sat. Poor Alistair, so solitary, one worries. She cast a fond look at her nephew. Cecil has been so good, popping over to check on him. Least I can do, Aunt Beatrice, Cecil said with an easy smile. Awful business. Hope you catch the fellow soon, Inspector. Inquiries are proceeding, Purbright said vaguely. He took a slow sip of his tea. It's a curious case. The more one looks into it, the more one finds these little puzzles, things that don't quite add up. Whitney leaned forward eagerly. Oh, trifles, mostly, Purbright said, his tone casual, almost dismissive. The sort of administrative loose ends that crop up. For instance, he continued, placing his cup down with a gentle click, we have the most ridiculous business of a disputed invoice from Miss Paisley's pharmacy. He did not look at anyone in particular, addressing his remarks to the teapot in the center of the table, a bottle of rather expensive French cologne it seems. Le voleur. It was charged to Mr. Finch's account some days ago, but Miss Finch, being the stickler he is, has sent the bill back, denies all knowledge of it. A complete mystery. He allowed a moment of silence to settle, then lifted his gaze and let it rest, with an expression of mild, polite inquiry on Cecil. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The young man's charming smile froze and began to crumble at the edges. A dark flush crept up from his cravat, suffusing his neck and cheeks. He picked up his teaspoon, looked at it as if he'd never seen one before, and put it down again with a clatter. Cologne? He stammered, his voice a fraction too high. French? No, I can't imagine who would. It's certainly not me. Beside him, Mrs. Appleyard had gone quite still. The color drained from her face, leaving her rouge standing out in two stark painted circles. Her hand, which had been resting on the tablecloth, flew to her nephew's arm, her fingers gripping his blazer with unconscious tightness. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Councillor Whitney, oblivious to the specific meaning, but keenly aware of the sudden catastrophic shift in atmosphere, watched the scene with the avid intensity of a hawk. His eyes darted from Cecil's crimson face to his aunt's pale one, then to the inspector's impassive expression. He sniffed the air, sensing a fresh and infinitely more interesting scandal was at hand. Purbright did not press his advantage. He had seen all he needed to see. The truth of the matter had been demonstrated not by a confession, but by a blush and a tremor. He gave a small placid smile. "Well, I expect it's just a simple clerical error on Mr. Paisley's part," he said, his voice returning to its normal conversational rhythm. "These things happen." He turned to the sergeant. "Another scone, love? I believe this one has currant." The spell was broken, but the air remained thick and heavy with unspoken words. The polite chatter of the copper kettle seemed very far away. It was a place of quiet bureaucracy, smelling faintly of paper and floor polish, its tall window looking out onto the unremarkable back of the fire station. It was, however, a room where fictions tended to wither. Purbright had invited Alistair Finch and Beatrice Appleyard for a final clarification, a phrase which in police parlance meant the time for polite invention was over. He had Sergeant Love serve them tea in the station's thick serviceable china. Miss Appleyard accepted with a trembling hand, her face a mask of anxious sorrow. Mr. Finch refused, sitting ramrod straight in his chair, his newly healed nose looking pinched and pale. He had the air of a man attending his own court-martial. Cecil, Purbright had decided, was a supporting player whose role in the drama had now concluded. The architects of the affair were the two people sitting before him. "Thank you both for coming," Purbright began, his voice calm and even. "I won't take up much of your time. I think we can now put an end to the speculation that has so disrupted the town this past week." He looked from one to the other. "Firstly, let me be clear. The incident did not involve hooligans from Chalford, nor does it have anything to do with Mr. Horace Dibdin and his controversial theories on horticulture. The truth is much closer to home, and altogether more domestic." He let the word domestic hang in the quiet air. "It began, I believe, not with a grand passion, but with small appetites," he continued, his gaze resting for a moment on Mrs. Appleyard. "The appetite for a lifestyle a little finer than one's means allow. Your nephew Cecil is a young man with a taste for the better things in life. A taste, for instance, for expensive French cologne." Mrs. Appleyard flinched as if struck. "And a taste perhaps for expensive marmalade," Purbright added, turning his mild gaze upon Mr. Finch. "The sort of small luxury one might take from the pantry of a wealthy acquaintance, assuming such a trivial item would never be missed." Finch's composure, as rigid and brittle as spun glass, developed a hairline crack. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "But you are not a man to miss such details, are you, Mr. Finch?" Purbright went on. "You would notice a single jar out of place, and you would certainly notice an unauthorized charge on a pharmacy bill. You are a man who balances his books, in every sense of the word, and finding them unbalanced, you would take steps to correct the error. You confronted the young man." Purbright paused, picturing the scene. "It happened at your home, I expect. You presented him with the evidence of his petty pilfering. There was an argument, not a shouting match, that is not your style, but a cold, precise indictment." Cecil, faced with exposure, panicked. "He is not a malicious man, I think, but a weak one," and in his pathetic cornered state he lashed out. "He struck you in the face." He looked directly at Finch's plastered nose. "That is the truth of it, isn't it? There was no ladder, there was no dizzy spell. There was just a squalid, undignified scuffle with a boy who had been stealing from you." Mrs. Appleyard let out a small, choked sob. Finch remained icily silent, his stillness a confession in itself. "The injury was one thing," Purbright said, his voice softening, with something that might have been sympathy, "but the humiliation was quite another. To be bested, to be made a fool of by a charming parasite, that was the unbearable part. It undermined your reputation for astute judgment. It made you a victim of a common, pathetic crime. So you created a fiction. You told everyone you had fallen. It was a simple lie designed to protect your dignity and keep the sordid truth private." He stood up and walked to the window, looking at the brick wall opposite. "But it didn't end there, did it? Because you were angry. You were furious with Cecil for his theft, with Mrs. Appleyard for bringing him into your orbit, with the world for allowing your pristine order to be violated. You felt you had been wronged, and you wanted a reckoning. A simple lie was not enough. You required theater." He turned back to face them. "The flower show was the perfect stage. Everyone was there. Your great rival, Mr. Dibdin. All the town gossips. You had already won your 8th trophy. Your public superiority was assured. and you decided to give them something else to talk about. You decided to turn your private shame into a public mystery. Mrs. Appleyard stared at him, her eyes wide with incomprehension, but Finch's expression had changed. A faint, cold glimmer of something pride, perhaps, had entered his eyes. "It was your own pair of broken, blood-stained spectacles, Mr. Finch," Purbright stated, his voice now devoid of all ambiguity. "After the scuffle, you kept them, and on the afternoon of the show, you walked into that marquee, removed your own trophy from its plinth, and placed the spectacles there in its stead. You created a sensational public puzzle out of your private grievance. You knew that suspicion would fall elsewhere, on Mr. Dibdin, or even on Mrs. Appleyard, the woman you had recently cast off. It was a quiet, exquisitely malicious act of vengeance against everyone you felt had failed you. You were not merely the victim, Mr. Finch. You were the author of the entire performance." The truth, stark and unadorned, finally filled the small office. It was the story of a bloody nose, a lie born of pride, and a final brilliant act of spite. Alistair Finch sat motionless, a man exposed not as a victim of a great crime, but as the architect of a petty one. There was no public trial, no dramatic courtroom confession. The intricate social crime conceived by Alistair Finch was quietly dismantled by the mundane machinery of the law. Cecil Appleyard appeared before the magistrate on a Tuesday morning, pleaded guilty to a charge of common assault and another of petty theft, and received a suspended sentence. The magistrate, having heard the details, gave the young man a stern lecture on the duties of a guest and the character of a gentleman, a speech which seemed to cause Cecil more discomfort than the sentence itself. The true punishment, as Purbright knew it would be, was administered by the town of Flaxborough itself. The story that trickled out was far less exciting than the initial theories, but it had the potent, enduring quality of truth. It was a shabby, slightly embarrassing story of a sponger, a lie and a moment of spite. For Mrs. Appleyard, who had curated a public image of tragic glamour, the shabby reality was unbearable. The whispers in the tea shop were no longer about her mysterious friendship with Mr. Finch but about her nephew's sticky fingers. Within a month, a for sale sign appeared in front of her chintz-filled villa. She was moving, it was said, to be closer to a sister in a town where the hedgerows were, presumably less fragrant and the gossip less specific. Councillor Whitney was deeply disappointed. He cornered Purbright outside the butcher's and expressed his dissatisfaction. "A family squabble and a bit of pilfering," he sniffed. "Frankly, Purbright, it's tawdry, it lacks narrative force." The business with Dibdin had a certain grandeur to it, a clash of titans. "This is just sordid." He seemed personally offended that the town's premier mystery had turned out to have such a commonplace solution. Alistair Finch was not charged with wasting police time. Purbright saw no need. Mr. Finch had received his sentence too. His reputation for flawless, steely integrity had been irrecoverably tarnished. He was now seen not as an enigma, but as a man capable of a theatrical and deeply childish tantrum. He withdrew even further into the sanctuary of Primrose Cottage. His hedge seemed to grow taller and more impenetrable. The Chalford Perpetual Challenge Cup was delivered to him quietly by a junior member of the Horticultural Society. There was no ceremony. His victory felt hollow, a footnote to the scandal he had authored himself. Purbright, driving past one afternoon, saw him in his garden, tending his new petunia seedlings, with a grim, solitary focus, a man left with nothing but his disciplined blooms for company. Life in Flaxborough, having deviated briefly from its course, settled back into its familiar placid rhythm. At the police station, the file on the case, a surprisingly slim volume for all the fuss it had caused, was typed up by Sergeant Love, signed by the inspector, and formally closed. Purbright placed it in the out tray for filing, a neat conclusion to a messy set of human emotion. The town's equilibrium, having been disturbed, was restored. He sat at his desk for a moment, listening to the gentle hum of a fly against the window pane, and the distant shunting of a train at the station. Then he reached into his in-tray, picked up the next file, and opened. It was a report concerning a garden gnome, of the fishing variety, that had been stolen from a lawn on Northgate Street. The owner was adamant that it was the work of a professional syndicate. Purbright picked up his pen. The work, as ever, continued.
Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.